Yeah, well, you're welcome back to class. In this class, we would be looking at the backlog refinement. Backlog refinement is also called the backlog grooming. So we call it either the backlog refinement meeting or the backlog grooming meeting. They are both of the same. Backlog refinement. We want to refine the backlog. That's making reference to the product backlog. That is what it actually means. We want to refine the product's backlog, or we want to groom the product's backlog. That's what the backlog refinement has to do. So here we go. Before we go further, while we were introducing the 3 events in Scrum from the 353 of Scrum, the 5 events in Scrum from the 353 of Scrum, while we were introducing the 5 events in Scrum from the 353 of Scrum, I mentioned that when we look at that screen, it had 6 meetings, and the 6th one is the backlog refinement. It's not part of the 5 events, but it's equally very important, and it has given a lot of value to the sprint. Permit me to also add that other frameworks in Agile also observe the backlog refinement meeting. In particular, Kanban observe the backlog refinement meeting also. Okay, so the backlog refinement meeting is for the team. It's led by the product owner. The Scrum Master is supporting and facilitating all the conversations. It could be more or less for the seniors. Permit me to use the word seniors. I would explain in a bit. The developers may not be present in the backlog refinement meeting, and I will explain to us why. But when the developers are not present, the tech lead would be present. A solution architect or a senior solution architect could be present also. So what happens during the backlog refinement meeting? The backlog refinement meeting is a scheduled meeting to plan for future sprints in Scrum. It's used to plan for future sprints in Scrum. The backlog refinement meeting is an adaptive meeting. You are using it to align what the stakeholder wants into future plans. We're looking at the product backlog, but we are now pre-arranging the future sprints. That's what the backlog refinement has to do with, and that is the value it brings. It gives us the avenue to plan ahead of time. For instance, you are in sprint 1. You've observed your sprint planning in sprint 1. You are running your daily stand-up in sprint 1. You are yet to get to the end of sprint 1, so you have not observed your sprint review and sprint retrospective yet. But you have a time, it's usually around 1 hour, to now begin to adjust and adapt your product backlog. New requirements are coming in from the stakeholders. New stories, new adjustments, new priorities are coming into the stakeholders. From the stakeholders. You are now planning ahead of time. You are creating new stories. You are reprioritizing the stories. You are preparing them for future sprints. You are also checking how much work can be done. and what are the outcomes. Let me show this to us in a moment. Let's look at the board again. From the backlog, I said the backlog refinement focuses on the product backlog. This is a current sprint, right? Now, in this current sprint, which is running from here, you can see the current sprint running. However, let's assume we have no stories here at all. Let me move everything back to the product backlog. Same as for this. You can either right click to move to the product backlog or click and drag to move everything. So we'll see from here, except for the active sprints, we have no story in future sprints, sprint 2 and sprint 3. Now, we are at a backlog refinement meeting now, and we're asking ourselves, after we deliver on these stories, what will be next? We could see from this story belongs to an epic approver. This story belongs to an epic approver, and foundation. So in the course of this sprint, current sprint, we would be able to complete the stories that's got to do with approver. That means we are done with those stories. And if we're able to complete some of the stories with foundation, what would then be next? We are still in the current sprint. We are in sprint 1. But in the backlog refinement meeting, we are now checking the other stories and asking ourselves, after approver and foundation, what will be next? Do we have any story still on approver in the product backlog? No. Do we have any story needed for foundation in the product backlog? Yes. So let's move those stories in the foundation. That is for future sprints. I'm trying to deselect. Okay. And these are the stories. Foundation, right? Any other foundation, none. So it will be safe for us to move these stories into sprint 2. Meaning, when we finished with the stories, we can now start to work on the foundation stories. This is what we would be doing in the sprint planning session, mind you, but we are looking ahead of time and we are planning ahead before the sprint planning. So let's assume that we have a total story point going by the team velocity. I have explained to us what we mean by team velocity in previous class. That is the total work a team is able to complete in previous sprints. When we get to module 4, for those taking the Scrum Master training, we would look at velocity again and have a clearer view, and we'll be demonstrating that from the board also. Okay, and it will be a reflection at the practicals too. So we've picked stories for foundation. We have a total point of 6 here. So if our team delivers on total story points of 10 in every sprint, that means we have capacity for 4 more. So the first question is, how much of these stories are we certain we'll be able to deliver in, going by the current sprint? Then, of course, after foundation, what would be next? What will be next on the epic? Of course, not roofing after foundation. Of course, not mechanical work. It should be block work. You should do the block work, then the plaster. So let's do a quick exercise here. Let's have rough estimates for each of this work. So the roofing, under the roofing as an epic, let's add 2 story points for this, meaning 2-day work. This lintel formation, let's add 3 story for it, 3-day work. Plastering, let's add another 3 days for plastering. Screeding, let's add 2 stories for screeding. Insert wire, let's add 1 day work for that. Wood treatment, let's add 2 days for wood treatment. We are just having relative estimation. Ideally, in sprint planning, estimation will be done with planning poker. I told us that in one of the previous classes. When we get to the practical, we will deal more on how to do planning poker. Planning poker is where all the team members will come around and we would look at each of the story, discuss on each of the story, and then now estimate how long that story will take. That is what the planning poker is. And I've also told us what Fibonacci sequence is. That is the estimation point we always use. And I've told us how the sequence runs: 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, on and on and on. That is the Fibonacci sequence. All right, so let's just add the remaining points. Plumbing, piping, let's add it for 2 days work. For plumbing, to install plumbing wares, let's add another 2-day work. The electrical fittings, let's make it a 1-day work. To run hot water testing, let's make that a 2-day work. I'm sure some of you are guessing along with me. Painting, let's paint in 3 days. It's not so much of a big building anyways. The floor and wall tiling, let's make that, how long should we make it? Floor and wall, 3 days. The idea in Scrum or in Agile is that, and I tell my team that no particular effort should go beyond 5 story points. Any work that is getting to 5 story points is big enough. That means if your story point is 1 point to 1 day, that is a 5-day work, right? So as a rule of thumb I use with my team, this is not a general consensus, but as a rule of thumb I use for my various teams, any story should not exceed 5 story points. So the question is, what if a story cannot be completed in 5 days or in 5 story point? Let me use 5 story point so I wouldn't confuse you that 5 points means 1 day. I had explained earlier that different teams come together to agree what the point translates into. So a technical or software development team, they could come around and say 1 point equals 1 hour of work, but for this illustration we're equating 1 point to mean 1 day, right? So what happens when a story is more than 5 days? Simple practice in Scrum, then you decompose that story further. You break that story into smaller bits. The bigger the story, the more difficult to follow through, the more difficult to have transparency in. So what we do as a practice, a smart Scrum Master wants to encourage the developers in particular to break stories down into smaller bits so that we can follow through with those stories. Okay, so window and door installation, let's add another 3 points. And then other aesthetics, let's add 5 points, assuming we don't know what the definition of others is. Okay, mind you, I said earlier that the team has capacity for 10 total story points per sprint. 10 total story points per sprint. Let's add 2 points here just for reference sake. Why is this guy jumping? And for environmental impact assessment, let's add another, what should we add it? 3 points. Let's make it deliberately 3 points, right? So we have 3 plus 2, 5, plus this 8, plus this 10. So we have a total of 10 points here. So we are now back to the sprint, the refinement meeting. We are back to the backlog refinement meeting, right? This is the current sprint we are on now, and this is our active board, and we are hoping to deliver this particular sprint by the end of the sprint. But in a backlog refinement, we are now planning for future sprints. We are aligning the requirement from the stakeholder. Where we need to create more stories, we are creating more stories. Where we need to adapt the stories, we are adapting the stories also, right? So we are in the current first sprint. Let's plan now for the second sprint. We've added 2 stories on foundation, which gives us a total of 6 points. We have 4 stories points to add left to it. So after foundation, we are going into block wall. Good enough lintel formation for block wall and parapets. Then which are the other block walls? There should be other block wall before lintel. Okay, it appears a story is missing here. We should see the actual laying of blocks for the block wall. Let's check that from the timeline and the block wall. Create openings, lintel formation, laying blocks. Okay, this had been done. When was it done? I want to take it out of done so that we can make use of it again. Let me put it back to in progress. Right, so we should be able to find it somewhere. Anyone that is crossed out would not be visible to us. It will be hidden somewhere. So now that I've made them visible, when we go back to the backlog, we should find those 2. Where would they be? Yes, you can see one here in sprint 3. Then another one creating opening, laying block. Yes, there's laying block here in sprint 2. So we could see from here that this had been moved to sprint 2. I made reference in the last class that anytime we move a story in a current sprint to another sprint, it appears on the same column. So that's why we have it in progress here. So for the future sprint, that's sprint 2, we have 5 points, 1 point, 1 point, making 7 points. and we have capacity for 3 more points. So let's add this one to it to make it a total of 10 points. So while we do this in the backlog refinement, we have planned for the sprint planning. This is still flexible, it is adaptable, changes could come. Any story we do not finish from here could join it, but we are preparing ahead of time, right? So after we finish with the block wall, we still have some other stories in block wall here. So it is safe for us to move this story to sprint 3 because they are still part of the block wall, and check if we have any other story for block wall. If there is need for more stories that are not on the board, we would create more stories for it. After block wall, what will be next? I think that should be the roofing, right? The roofing would come next. Roofing, foundation, block wall, roofing, plastering, in that order. So since we have 4 stories here, we can look at the stories that's got to do with roofing and check which one would be next and add them to that. So this is exactly what we do at the backlog refinements meeting. We are preparing for future sprints, but yet also aligning those stories to what the stakeholders want, making them adaptive, making them adjustable. It's similar to what the sprint planning session is for. So when a team does backlog refinement or backlog grooming effectively, by the time they get to the sprint planning, they have lesser work to do and their sprint will roll on better. And I did mention also that it depends, it comes differently for different teams. All the developers may not be needed at the backlog refinement meeting. When there is a senior developer, the senior developer could be added to that meeting alongside with the product owner, the scrum master, the solution architect if there is need for a solution architect on the job, a tester also. All the key components needed would be pulled into the backlog refinement meeting. All right, let's go back to the slide and continue from where we stopped on the slide. So at the backlog refinement, there is what we call the deep criteria, and I'll explain that to us. The deep criteria. It is important. It is similar to the inverse criteria used for sprint planning. A quick reminder, the inverse criteria is used for sprint planning. Inverse again stands for independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable. That is a criteria used along with sprint planning. For the backlog refinement or backlog grooming, we also have the deep criteria, and deep criteria stands for each of the story must be detailed appropriately, meaning each story should have the full details needed. It must be detailed appropriately. Each of the story should be estimated. Each of the story should be emergent, which stands for adaptable, flexible story that can give way for adjustments. And each of the story should be prioritized. And those were some of the things we did here. When we were planning for sprint 2, we knew based on the project we are working on that you can't bring the mechanical work before block work. So block work has a higher priority and it is story by story. Even within a particular epic, you would also notice that I needed to find the laying blocks as a story before the creating openings, because you need to lay the blocks first before you start to create openings on the block. So that is what the deep criteria stands for. I've explained also the members in attendance, and I've also related it to the sprint planning. A good team does backlog refinement ahead. So while your developers are squarely focusing on what they need to do, the senior planning units, don't let me use the word senior, a part of that team could be planning ahead of the rest of the team. And of course, it focuses on the product goal still, because the product goal is what the stakeholder wants you to deliver. And I've also mentioned the actions that we undertake in it and time boxed of the backlog refinement. It is relatively 1 hour. It could be more, it could be a little less, but ideally 1 hour for the backlog refinement meeting. And that will be the end of this class. If you have any question, please shoot them across. I'll be glad to give answers to them. See you again in the next class.